Imagine this. You are crouched behind a marble column in the holiest halls of the Vatican. The air is thick with incense and something far more intoxicating. It is the year 1501, and through the shadows cast by flickering candelabras, you witness something no eye should ever see within these sacred walls. The sound of silk brushing against stone mingles with laughter, echoing through corridors where saints once walked. Your heart pounds against your ribs as you realize you're about to witness the most scandalous soiree in papal history, an orgy so depraved it would make even ancient Romans blush with shame. The October air carries the scent of roasted chestnuts through the Vatican's chambers. But tonight, these humble chestnuts will become props in a performance that will forever stain the reputation of the Catholic Church. In the private chambers of Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, 50 courtesans prepare for an evening that will be recorded in the most secret diary of Renaissance Rome, preserved in the Vatican archives for centuries as a forbidden confession hidden beneath layers of pious prayers. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting the like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The man who became the most perverse pope in history was born as Rodrigo de Borja on the 1st of January, 1431, in the Spanish city of Zadova near Valencia. The dust of Spanish roads clung to his childhood memories, but fate would carry him far from those humble beginnings to the marble corridors of Vatican power. His uncle Alfonso de Borja had already begun climbing the ecclesiastical hierarchy, and when Alfonso became Pope Callistus III in 1455, Rodrigo's fate was sealed like wax on a papal document. At the age of 25, Rodrigo was appointed cardinal deacon, not by divine calling or spiritual devotion, but by the ancient art of nepotism that ran through the church's veins like poison in a dying body. The young Spaniard arrived in Rome with hunger in his eyes and burning ambition in his chest, ready to devour any opportunity the eternal city could offer. The Rome of the late 15th century was a city of contradictions that would have made Dante weep with recognition. By day, pilgrims knelt in reverence before golden altars, their prayers rising like smoke toward the heavens. By night, those same streets witnessed transactions that enriched the merchants of the flesh beyond their wildest dreams. The papal court had become a marketplace where everything, including salvation itself, had a price written in golden ducats. Rodrigo Borgia understood this world better than most. He amassed wealth with the methodical precision of a spider, weaving its web, collecting ecclesiastical benefits across Europe, like a merchant hoarding precious gems. His lifestyle was that of a Renaissance prince rather than a man of God. Lavish banquets, magnificent palaces, and a succession of mistresses who bore him children with the regularity of seasonal harvests. The most significant of these relationships was with Vanosa de Catane, a Roman noblewoman whose beauty was matched only by her understanding of how to navigate the treacherous waters of papal politics. Between 1474 and 1482, she gave Rodrigo 4 children who would become central figures in the dark drama about to unfold: Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Joffre. Each child represented a chess piece in Rodrigo's grand game of power, their lives sacrificed on the altar of their father's boundless ambition. Even as a cardinal, Rodrigo's behavior scandalized Rome, which was no small feat in a city where scandal was as common as morning bread. Pope Pius II wrote him a scathing letter in 1460 condemning his conduct in Siena, which had shocked the entire city and court. But shame was a luxury Rodrigo could not afford. He had a papacy to win, and moral qualms were obstacles to overcome, not principles to honor. The conclave of August 1492 unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of corruption. Behind closed doors in the Sistine Chapel, beneath what would become Michelangelo's future masterpiece, 23 cardinals gathered to choose the next vicar of Christ. Gold changed hands with the fluidity of water. Promises were whispered like prayers, and benefices were distributed like communion wafers. When the smoke finally cleared on the 11th of August, 1492, Rodrigo Borgia emerged as Pope Alexander VI, a victory achieved through what contemporaries openly acknowledge as simony, the buying and selling of sacred offices. Astonishingly, the Romans celebrated. They had grown accustomed to their Spanish cardinal and anticipated a pontificate of magnificence and vigor. Bonfires illuminated the seven hills. Torchlit processions wound through ancient streets, and triumphal arches rose like prayers manifested in stone and wood. The new pope's coronation at St. Peter's Basilica on the 26th of August was met with what observers called the greatest ovation ever received by a pontiff. Alexander VI began his reign with measures that seemed to promise reform. He restored order to Rome's streets where over 200 murders had occurred in just a few months before his election. He established districts with magistrates empowered to keep the peace and personally heard complaints every Tuesday, dispensing justice with what contemporary observers praised as admirable efficiency. For a brief moment, it seemed divine providence had placed the right man on St. Peter's throne. But power, like wine, reveals character rather than creates it. Alexander's early reforms were overshadowed by his relentless pursuit of advancement for his children, particularly his sons Juan and Cesare. One was named Duke of Gandia in Spain and married to a cousin of the Spanish king. Cesare, despite being only 18, was appointed Archbishop of Valencia and later elevated to cardinal positions he treated as stepping stones rather than sacred vocations. The papal chambers during Alexander's reign became a theater where the sacred and the profane performed an obscene ballet. Dinners stretched into the early hours, accompanied by entertainments that pushed the boundaries of acceptable behavior, even by Renaissance standards. Alexander's mistress, Julia Farnese, known throughout Rome as Julia the Beautiful for her extraordinary beauty, moved through the Vatican corridors with the same freedom as any cardinal. Her presence was a constant reminder that the Pope's spiritual vows had been trampled by earthly desires. Johann Burchard entered this world of contradictions as a meticulous observer, armed with a quill and an unforgiving memory. Born around 1450 in Niederhaslach, Alsace, this priest had studied canon law and risen through the ecclesiastical ranks to become the papal master of ceremonies, a position that granted him intimate access to the most secret moments of papal life. From 1483 under Pope Sixtus, the fourth Burchard kept what he called his diarium, a detailed diary recording both the magnificent ceremonies and the scandalous conduct of 5 different popes. Burchard was no romantic. He possessed the soul of an accountant and the eye of a court stenographer. His writings lack the embellishments of contemporary chroniclers, but carry the weight of truth precisely because of their dry, objective tone. He recorded papal ceremonies with the same attention to detail he devoted to papal scandals, creating a documentary record that would eventually discomfort even the most hardened Vatican archivists. The Master of Ceremonies held a unique position within the papal hierarchy, not high enough to participate in the corruption, nor low enough to be excluded from witnessing it. Like a shadow cast by candlelight, he moved through the Vatican's most private spaces, observing everything, while seeming to matter little. Cardinals trusted him for ceremonial matters and forgot his presence during moments when discretion should have prevailed. This invisibility became his greatest asset as a chronicler of papal vice. By the late 1490s, the Borgia family's behavior began drawing negative attention across Europe. Alexander's eldest son Juan had become Duke of Gandia, but his character proved as corrupt as his rise was undeserved. Stories circulated of his cruelty, sexual excesses, and incompetence as a military commander. The golden boy of the Borgia dynasty was becoming a liability even his devoted father could not ignore. The events of the 14th of June, 1497 changed everything. Juan's body was found floating in the Tiber River, his throat slit and his body bearing 9 wounds. The murder shocked Rome and struck Alexander with a grief so profound that observers wondered if divine justice had finally visited the Borgia family. For 3 days and nights, the Pope refused to eat or sleep. He wept behind closed doors like a broken man, rather than the powerful pontiff who had once intimidated kings. In his anguish, Alexander announced a program of ecclesiastical reform. He called for measures to curb the luxury of the papal court, reorganize the apostolic chancery, and suppress simony and concubinage. For a brief moment, it seemed personal tragedy might accomplish what years of criticism had failed to achieve. A commission of cardinals and canonists began drafting ordinances that anticipated the reforms of the Council of Trent, still decades in the future. But grief, like everything else in Alexander's character, proved temporary. Within months, the reform proposals were forgotten, filed away like embarrassing love letters from youth. The Pope's attention turned to his surviving children, particularly Cesare, whose iron will and ruthless ambition now drove the family's agenda. If Juan had been Alexander's heart, Cesare was his sword-sharp cold and utterly without conscience. Cesare possessed a magnetism that drew both admirers and enemies. Tall, handsome, and gifted with an intelligence bordering on genius, he was initially destined for the church like his father. But Cesare's talents lay in warfare and politics rather than theology. He resigned his cardinalate in 1498, the first cardinal in history to voluntarily abandon the sacred office and set his sights on secular power. The political landscape of Italy provided Cesare with opportunities that would have challenged even Machiavelli's imagination. The French king Louis XII needed papal approval for the annulment of his marriage. While several Italian duchies were ripe for conquest by a sufficiently ruthless commander, Alexander saw in these circumstances an opportunity to carve out a kingdom for his son, even if it meant allying with foreign invaders against his fellow Italians. Through a combination of siege warfare, assassinations, and political manipulation, Cesare carved out a dominion in central Italy that made him one of the most powerful men in Europe. His methods were so effective that Niccolò Machiavelli later used him as a model for the prince, admiring Cesare's ability to combine cruelty with efficiency in pursuit of political goals. But such success required resources even the papal treasury could not easily provide, leading Alexander to increasingly creative methods of fundraising. The sale of indulgences, ecclesiastical offices, and even cardinal hats became systematic during Alexander's later years. Wealthy families could buy church positions for their sons, effectively purchasing salvation alongside social status. The College of Cardinals expanded not by spiritual merit, but by financial contributions, as Alexander appointed 47 new cardinals during his reign. Each appointment represented thousands of ducats flowing into the papal treasury and ultimately Cesare's war chest. Rome, during this period, seemed a city under occupation by its own rulers. The Borgia family treated the papal states as their personal kingdom, with Alexander as patriarch and Cesare as heir apparent. Lucrezia, despite later rehabilitations of her reputation, was used as a political pawn in marital alliances that served family interests more than her personal happiness. Her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza was annulled on grounds of impotence when political circumstances shifted, and she was quickly remarried to Alfonso of Bisceglie, who was later murdered, possibly on Cesare's orders, when that alliance no longer served Borgia interests. The Vatican chambers during these years became a stage for increasingly elaborate entertainments that tested the limits of acceptable behavior, even by Renaissance standards. Alexander enjoyed theatrical performances, musical concerts, and dinners that stretched into the early hours. Guests included cardinals, ambassadors, wealthy merchants, and an assortment of courtesans whose beauty was matched only by their discretion or lack thereof. These gatherings served multiple purposes beyond mere entertainment. They were displays of papal wealth and power, opportunities for political negotiations, and testing grounds for loyalty among Alexander's supporters. Cardinals who participated in the Pope's entertainments became implicated in his behavior, making them reluctant to criticize or betray him. Those who declined invitations marked themselves as potential enemies, subject to the kind of reprisals that had befallen so many Borgia opponents. The autumn of 1501 found the Borgia family at the height of their power and perhaps their corruption. Cesare had successfully completed his conquest of the Romagna, earning praise from military observers across Europe. Alexander had weathered several political crises, including the invasion of Charles VIII and ongoing conflicts with rival noble families. The Jubilee year of 1500 had brought hundreds of thousands of pilgrims to Rome, filling both the papal treasury and the city's brothels with equal enthusiasm. It was in this atmosphere of triumph and moral decadence that Cesare Borgia conceived what would become known as the Banquet of the Chestnuts. The exact motivation for the event remains unclear. Was it a celebration, a political theater, or simply the logical culmination of years of increasingly scandalous behavior? Contemporary sources offer various explanations, but agree on the essential facts that shocked even the most seasoned observers of papal vice. On the 31st of October, 1501, the eve of All Saints' Day, when the line between the sacred and the profane is traditionally said to be thinnest. The date may have been chosen deliberately, or it may have been mere coincidence that the most infamous papal orgy in history occurred on a night when ghosts were said to walk freely among the living. In any case, the symbolism was perfect. On a night dedicated to remembering the dead, the Borgia family was about to commit acts that would kill what remained of papal dignity. Cesare's chambers in the Vatican occupied part of the papal palace that had been magnificently decorated by Pinturicchio during the early years of Alexander's reign. The frescoed walls depicted scenes from classical mythology and Christian history, creating an ironic backdrop for events that belonged to neither tradition. These halls, designed to showcase the Borgia Pope's wealth and cultural sophistication, would become the setting for an evening that epitomized everything critics had accused the family of representing. The guest list for the evening revealed the breadth of corruption the Borgias had achieved. Cardinals who should have spent the night in prayer mingled with Roman nobles whose wealth had bought their silence about previous papal scandals. Diplomats from various European courts attended, perhaps seeing the evening as an opportunity to gather intelligence on papal intentions, or perhaps simply drawn by curiosity about how far the Borgias would push the boundaries of acceptable behavior. But the true stars of the night were the 50 courtesans Cesare had assembled for his guests' entertainment. These were not common prostitutes plucked from Rome's streets, but sophisticated women who understood the delicate art of providing pleasure while maintaining the discretion powerful men required. Many had prior experience in papal entertainments. They knew the rules of the game and the rewards awaiting those who pleased their influential patrons. Johann Burgert, in his capacity as master of ceremonies, was present that night, not as a participant, but as an observer. His official duties required him to be available for any ceremonial functions that might arise even during private entertainments. This professional obligation placed him in the perfect position to witness and record events that other observers might have preferred to forget. His account, written in Latin with the clinical detachment of a medical examiner, preserves details that illuminate both the specific events of that night and the broader moral climate of Alexander's papacy. According to Burchard's meticulous record, the evening began conventionally with a dinner served in Cesare's private chambers. The menu featured delicacies appropriate to the season and the social status of the guests, accompanied by wines from the papal cellars that had been carefully aged in Roman caves. Conversation flowed as smoothly as the wine, touching on topics of politics, military campaigns, and artistic patronage subjects that allowed the assembled company to demonstrate their sophistication and cultural refinement. The atmosphere began to shift when servants cleared the dinner plates and the evening's true entertainment commenced. The 50 courtesans, dressed in silks and velvets, carefully chosen to display their physical attributes to best advantage, began to dance for the assembled guests. The music provided by musicians sworn to secrecy about the night's events created rhythms that encouraged increasingly intimate movements. What followed defied even the broad definitions of acceptable behavior that had evolved during Alexander's papacy. As Burchard recorded with his characteristic precision, the women initially danced clothed, but as the night progressed and the wine continued to flow, garments were gradually discarded until the performers acted entirely naked. This transformation from conventional entertainment to explicit display occurred gradually enough for guests to adjust their comfort levels, but decisively enough that no one could claim ignorance of the evening's ultimate direction. The centerpiece of the evening's entertainment involved the chestnuts that gave the banquet its name. Servants removed the candelabras from the tables and placed them on the floor around the room, creating pools of flickering light separated by areas of shadow. Chestnuts were scattered across the floor between these light sources, and the naked courtesans were instructed to crawl on hands and knees to collect them, their bodies illuminated by candlelight as they moved through the makeshift obstacle course. According to Burchard's account, Pope Alexander VI observed these proceedings from a seat of honor, accompanied by Cesare and Lucrezia. The presence of the Pope's daughter at such an event has puzzled historians for centuries. Was she a willing participant in the family's corruption, or a victim of circumstances beyond her control? Contemporary sources offer conflicting interpretations, but all agree she was present when the evening reached its climax of degradation. The final phase of the entertainment involved competitions among the male guests to see who could have sexual relations with the greatest number of courtesans. Prizes were offered: silk tunics, shoes, berettas, and other luxury items that represented significant value in an era when such goods were largely handmade. The competitions were conducted publicly, with servants keeping score of each participant's performance, transforming intimate human connection into a spectacle for papal amusement. Burchard's account of these events was preserved in the Vatican's secret archives, sealed from public view for centuries. When Pope Leo XIII opened the archives to researchers in the late 19th century, he specifically expressed reluctance to allow access to documents that might damage Alexander VI's reputation. The fact that such caution was necessary more than 4 centuries after the events described suggests the enduring power of the scandal Burchard had so carefully documented. The morning after the banquet of the chestnuts found Rome unchanged on its surface, but fundamentally altered in its spiritual foundations. Pilgrims continued arriving for masses at St. Peter's Basilica. Cardinals maintained their schedules of meetings and ceremonies, and the Pope himself appeared at public audiences as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But knowledge of the previous night's events spread through the city's network of servants, guards, and minor officials who had witnessed or heard about the papal orgy. News of the banquet traveled beyond Rome through the diplomatic correspondence of foreign ambassadors who had attended the event or learned of it from reliable sources. Letters preserved in European archives document the shock and disgust of observers who thought themselves immune to surprise about papal behavior. Even representatives of secular rulers who maintained their own courts of considerable moral flexibility expressed astonishment at what had transpired within the Vatican's sacred precincts. The political implications of the scandal extended far beyond questions of personal morality. Reformers across Europe, including figures like Girolamo Savonarola in Florence, seized on reports of the banquet as evidence that the papacy itself had become irredeemably corrupt. Calls for ecclesiastical councils to depose Alexander VI gained new urgency, bolstered by detailed accounts of behavior that seemed to confirm the worst accusations against the Borgia Pope. Alexander's response to the criticism was characteristically defiant. Rather than express remorse or implement reforms, he intensified his support for Cesare's military campaigns and continued living with the same magnificent excess that had characterized his entire papacy. If anything, the scandal seemed to free him from any constraints that had previously limited his behavior, as if public acknowledgement of his corruption released him from the need to maintain even superficial respectability. The banquet of the chestnuts occurred near the end of Alexander's papacy, but was not an isolated incident of moral failure. Rather, it represented the logical culmination of years of escalating corruption that had transformed the papal court into something unrecognizable to earlier generations of Christian believers. The sacred and the profane had become so thoroughly intertwined that distinguishing between them required an effort few were willing to make. Cesare Borgia's career continued to flourish immediately after the scandal, suggesting that moral outrage had little impact on political calculations in Renaissance Italy. His military successes continued to earn praise from observers who admired effectiveness, regardless of the personal character of those who achieved it. Machiavelli's later analysis of Cesare's methods explicitly separated political skill from moral virtue, arguing that successful rulers must be willing to employ any means necessary to achieve their ends. But success built on such foundations proved temporary. Alexander VI died on the 18th of August, 1503, possibly of malaria, but surrounded by rumors of poisoning that reflected the atmosphere of suspicion and violence that had characterized his reign. His death brought immediate consequences for his children. Cesare's political support evaporated without papal protection, and he died fighting as a common mercenary in Spain only 4 years later. Lucretia survived to become Duchess of Ferrara, but her later life was overshadowed by the scandals of her youth and her family's notorious reputation. The new Pope Julius II refused to occupy the Borgia chambers where the banquet of the chestnuts had taken place. He moved to the upper floor apartments, which he commissioned Raphael to decorate with frescoes that would become some of the most celebrated artworks in Vatican history. This physical relocation symbolized a broader attempt to distance the papacy from the moral failures of Alexander's reign. Though the damage to the papal reputation proved harder to repair than the tarnished chambers, the historical assessment of the banquet of the chestnuts has varied with the moral and political climate of later eras. Catholic historians of the 19th and early 20th centuries often questioned the accuracy of Burchard's account, arguing that a reliable witness could not have documented such extreme behavior, or that later interpolations had corrupted the original text. Protestant historians, by contrast, embraced the scandal as evidence supporting their criticisms of papal authority and Catholic claims to moral leadership. Modern historians generally accept the basic accuracy of Burchard's account while placing it in the broader context of Renaissance Italian culture. They note that sexual displays and public entertainments with prostitutes were not uncommon among secular rulers of the time, making Alexander's behavior shocking primarily because of his position as head of the Catholic Church, rather than because such conduct was unknown in contemporary society. The architectural setting of the banquet adds another layer of historical irony to the events of that October night. The halls where the orgy took place had been decorated by Pinturicchio with frescoes depicting episodes from classical mythology and Christian history. Ancient gods and saints watched from the painted walls as scenes unfolded that would have scandalized both pagan and Christian sensibilities, creating a visual commentary on the distance between artistic ideals and human reality. Archaeological investigations of the Vatican's chambers have revealed details about the physical layout that help explain how such events could occur within the papal palace. The Borgia apartments were designed with multiple chambers, connected by corridors that allowed for both public ceremonies and private entertainments. The acoustic isolation between rooms meant that activities in one area might not be audible in adjacent spaces, providing the privacy needed for Alexander's increasingly extreme behavior. The preservation of Burchard's diary in the Vatican's secret archives raises questions about the Church's relationship with its own history. For centuries, these documents remained sealed accessible only to a handful of scholars who had received special permission from papal authorities. The decision to maintain such records while restricting access to them suggests an acknowledgement of their historical importance, combined with embarrassment over their content. Contemporary accounts from sources other than Burchard provide corroborating evidence for at least some version of the events described. Diplomatic correspondence of the period includes references to papal entertainments that pushed the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Though few sources provide the explicit details that make Burchard's account so compelling, the convergence of multiple sources pointing to similar conclusions strengthens the case for accepting the basic historicity of the Banquet of the Chestnuts. The scandal's impact on later papal history cannot be measured solely in terms of immediate political consequences. Alexander VI's behavior, culminating in events like the Banquet of the Chestnuts, provided ammunition for Protestant reformers who argued that the papacy itself had become irredeemably corrupt. Martin Luther's criticisms of papal authority gained credibility from well-documented examples of moral failures at the highest levels of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. The Counter-Reformation that began in the mid-16th century represented in part a response to scandals like the Banquet of the Chestnuts. Church leaders recognized that moral reform was necessary to restore papal credibility and counter Protestant criticisms. The Council of Trent's emphasis on clerical discipline and the establishment of seminaries for priestly education addressed issues that had been dramatically illustrated by Alexander VI's conduct. But reform came at a cost that extended beyond mere policy changes. The Baroque magnificence of post-Tridentine papal ceremonies represented an attempt to restore dignity to papal authority through visual splendor and carefully choreographed ritual. The spontaneous entertainments that had characterized Alexander's court gave way to formal performances designed to emphasize papal majesty while minimizing opportunities for scandal. The psychological impact of events like the Banquet of the Chestnuts on participants and observers remains difficult to assess from a historical distance. For the courtesans who performed that night, the experience likely represented a professional obligation rather than a personal degradation. Their social position made such employment an economic necessity rather than a moral choice. For the church officials who attended the evening may have represented either willing participation in corruption or reluctant conformity to papal expectations that carried the threat of professional reprisals. The broader Roman population's response to knowledge of papal behavior reveals the complex relationship between religious authority and popular faith. Despite widespread knowledge of Alexander's moral failures, pilgrims continued flocking to Rome, masses continued to be celebrated, and the sacramental system continued to function. This suggests that popular Catholicism had developed sufficient theological sophistication to distinguish between the personal validity of church officials and the validity of their religious functions. The Banquet of the Chestnuts represents more than a mere isolated incident of papal misconduct. It illuminates the broader transformation of Renaissance Italy from medieval Christendom to the early modern European state system. Alexander VI's behavior reflected the values of secular princes who used luxury and spectacle to demonstrate power. But his position as the spiritual leader of Catholic Christianity created contradictions that ultimately proved unsustainable. The night of the 31st of October, 1501 thus stands as a pivotal moment in papal history. the point at which the tension between spiritual authority and temporal power reached a crisis that demanded resolution. The scandal forced subsequent popes to choose between worldly magnificence and moral credibility, a choice that would shape the development of the Catholic Church for centuries. Looking back across more than 5 centuries to that candlelit night in the Vatican's chambers, we see reflections of humanity's eternal struggle between sacred aspirations and profane desires. The chestnuts scattered across the marble floors of the papal chambers were humble fruits that became symbols of how far human dignity can fall when power escapes moral constraints. In a world where such contrasts still exist, where spiritual leaders sometimes fail their followers, where power corrupts even those called to serve higher purposes, the banquet of the chestnut serves as both a historical scandal and an enduring cautionary tale. The candles that illuminated that notorious night have long since burned out. The participants have crumbled to dust in Roman graves, and the very halls where such scenes unfolded now display priceless artworks to reverent tourists. But Burchard's careful Latin prose preserves those moments when the line between the sacred and the profane collapsed entirely. When the Vicar of Christ became indistinguishable from the most dissolute Roman emperor, and when chestnuts scattered across marble floors bore witness to the distance between human ambition and divine calling. Ultimately, perhaps that is the true meaning of Alexander VI's forbidden orgy, not as evidence of individual moral failure, but as a mirror reflecting humanity's eternal capacity for both transcendence and degradation. The same species that built soaring cathedrals and created sublime religious art also gathered in papal chambers to witness spectacles that defied the very foundations of spiritual authority. The chestnuts scattered across those Vatican floors were gathered before dawn. But the questions they represent about power, faith, and human nature continue to scatter across the floors of history, waiting for each generation to decide what it will do with the legacy left by the most perverse pope who ever claimed to hold the keys to heaven.